I understand that at this time of year you often sing a song that asks the question, were you there? Well, I'm here this morning to tell you that I was. I was there on Friday, there at the cross, standing beside Jesus' mother, watching the whole thing. I watched them divide his clothes among themselves, carving up his few possessions as though he was already dead and gone. And I only realized later how even a small thing like that could be the fulfillment of prophecy. Evidence that even then the Almighty was still in control. It was there at the cross that Jesus entrusted me with the care of his mother, an honor that almost broke my heart, a plea from a friend that I could never refuse. And I was there when later the soldiers came to break the legs of those they had crucified to speed their deaths, only to discover that Jesus was already gone. Again, in fulfillment of the prophetic word that the Lord had given to us so long ago, Jesus was the true Passover lamb, and so not one of his bones was broken. I was there on Saturday as well, though claiming I was there seems like a gross exaggeration. None of us was really there. We were all in shock, lost in our own little worlds as we waited. It was the Sabbath. It was Passover. But there was no rest. There was no celebration. There was simply endurance. There was waiting and wondering and grieving. Then on Sunday morning, before the sun was even up, Mary of Magdala, you might know her as Mary Magdalene, went with some of the other women to the tomb where Joseph and Nicodemus had laid him late Friday afternoon. But it wasn't long after Mary and the others had left before there was a pounding at the door. It was Mary, back from the tomb, breathlessly telling us that the stone had been removed. The tomb had been forced open. And she was convinced that Jesus' body had been stolen, desecrated, discarded. It's hard to know which was our greatest fear. In an instant, Peter and I took off at a run. It wasn't all that far, just north past the bulk of old Herod's palace, out the Ganath gate, and at that time of the day, the streets were almost empty. Yet it still felt as though my feet simply couldn't move fast enough. I needed to be there instantly. Somewhere along the way, Peter got left behind. I arrived at the tomb alone, and sure enough, the stone had been thrust aside. And seeing that, I pulled up short. For all my hurry to get there, I suddenly found that I was in no hurry to actually enter the tomb. I don't know what I thought I'd see, and that might have been the worst part of it. Not knowing and not being sure I even wanted to know. Eventually, though, I steeled myself to take a peek, but in the early morning gloom, all I could see was the white of the grave clothes lying there. And that's when Peter arrived, huffing and puffing. And yet, he didn't pause for an instant. He went straight into the tomb. Of course, that was Peter. For him to think was to act or to speak, and sometimes we even wondered about the thinking part. But that morning, as he stood there just inside the tomb, I could tell that the wheels were turning. Though what he was thinking, I couldn't tell. He seemed to be staring intently at the place where the body was, where I'd seen the white of the grave clothes. After a moment, I followed him in. And that's when I was finally able to see things clearly. The linen wrappings were lying there, right where the body should have been, except there was no body. The wrappings were simply empty. And the headcloth was also there, lying right where it should have been, but now with no head to support it. I stood there, dumbfounded, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My brain went into overdrive, trying to come up with some scenario that would explain a missing body and the grave clothes lying there as I was seeing them. Went back to that moment when Mary had come bursting through the door. What was it she'd said? That maybe somebody had taken the body. Could that be it? The soldiers who'd been sent to the tomb were also gone. Could they have taken his body? But to what purpose? To deny him a proper burial? To shame Jesus and his memory even further? Later, when we came to know the truth, we realized how ridiculous that was. If they'd wanted to shame him further, there was absolutely no point in doing it quietly. Shame depends on exposure, on publicity, on people knowing. If that was their motive, they'd failed completely. Could it have been simple revenge? An act of spite by Caiaphas and the others? Would it have been enough for them to deny his body to us? Or to deny him that proper burial that his mother had longed for? Even if they were the only ones who knew. Maybe. But then if that was the case, I couldn't see how later on they wouldn't have announced that fact as loudly as they could, if only to stop our preaching. All they had to do to stop us was produce a body. And why take the time to unwrap him? My eyes kept going back to the grave clothes. I began to wonder when the soldiers had left and why. I thought maybe someone came along after they were gone, but before Mary and the others got here, and simply broke into the tomb. Though why anyone would do that, I could not fathom. No Jewish person would do it. Certainly not during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and they would know that we don't bury valuables with our dead, not like so many of the Gentiles do. We know that just as God has provided for us in this life, so He'll provide everything we need in the life to come, with the most important thing of all simply being His grace. And if it was a Gentile who had broken in, why take the body and leave the wrappings? You'd think someone looking for something to steal would have done the opposite. Again, the grave clothes were the issue. One last possibility. Maybe Joseph, whose tomb this was, had now made other arrangements, found some other place to put our Lord. But that made no sense either. Joseph would never have done that in the middle of the night. There was no need. He had nothing to hide. He'd already gone publicly to Pilate to ask for the body. And I couldn't conceive of him doing something like that without telling the rest of us. And again, it made no sense at all to unwrap the body and leave the grave clothes there. It kept coming back to the grave clothes. There was no reason for them to still be here when the body wasn't. And even if there was some reason I couldn't come up with, a hasty removal of the body by night would have left them flung all over the tomb. But that's not what I was seeing. Instead, they were so orderly. And I realized that's what I'd been struggling with. It was the wrappings. What I saw made no sense. Again, I tried to imagine a series of events that would explain what I was seeing. The way the grave clothes were lying, it was like Jesus' body had simply vanished from inside them. Essentially, they just collapsed in place, lying there arranged just as they would have been if the body had still been there. And that's when I got it. That's when I believed. The reason Jesus' body wasn't there is that he'd left both the tomb and the wrappings behind. I didn't know how it had happened, but he was gone. He was loose. He was elsewhere, out there, somewhere. I had no idea where, but it didn't matter. He had risen on the third day. This is what he meant. Death could not defeat him. The tomb could not contain him. The authorities could not restrain him. In fact, the whole universe was too small for his glory, and my own heart was too small for the joy it now contained. We'd always believed there would be a resurrection, some far-off day when God would restore us to life. But what Jesus had shown us was that death was defeatable now. That far-off day that we'd been waiting for had begun to dawn with the rising of the sun that morning. The resurrection body we'd been promised was what Jesus inhabited right now. He was a part of that new creation God said was coming. He had been changed in a twinkling of an eye, as they say. His poor, beaten, perishable body had now put on imperishability. His all too mortal body, the one that he had taken to the cross on Friday, had now put on immortality. And this new body was one that could apparently pass through grave clothes just as easily as it was later to pass through locked doors. Now, don't get me wrong. That doesn't mean that it wasn't a real body. It was real enough that Thomas would be invited to touch it. It was real enough that it could break bread, make a fire, cook some fish. Our risen Lord could be held. He could eat. He could even breathe upon us. He was not some vision, some hallucination, some hologram. He was there. He was real. He was alive. And that's what I realized as I stood there in that almost empty tomb. And that's why, without having actually seen Jesus himself, I believed. The grave clothes were there, but he was not. Later, when we did see Jesus, and this would be for the second time, because we saw him repeatedly over the next few weeks. When we saw him, he told Thomas that while he, Thomas, had believed because he'd seen Jesus, there was a special blessing for those who believed without having seen Jesus. And I wondered, did that include me? I wasn't sure. What I was sure of, though, was that God had given me all the evidence I'd needed. What I'd seen in the tomb was enough for me to believe right then and there. And yet, Jesus continued to provide us with evidence in abundance. He appeared over and over again, and not just to us, but to hundreds. What I came to realize was that the Almighty does not ask us to have what you might call blind faith. Rather, he invites us to open our eyes to the many convincing proofs he provides. I pray that you'll explore that evidence for yourselves. Because there is nothing in this world more worth knowing. Nothing in this world more worth being sure of than this. The other thing that I wanted you to know on this morning of mornings is what this means for us. Jesus, you see, was simply the first fruits. The rest of the harvest is still to come. All of those who belong to him. I don't know how you feel about your current body, but let me tell you, eventually it will disappoint you. And that is because it is a part of this fallen and flawed creation. These bodies tie us to the earth in which we'll be buried. They tie us to habits. They tie us to longings. They tie us to our addiction to sin. They are bodies that get tired. They are bodies that wear out. They are bodies that eventually will die. But these are not our final bodies. Our final body is the resurrection body. It is a body like the one in which Jesus left the tomb that morning. It is immortal. It is imperishable. It is a part of that coming new creation in which death and grief and pain and tears will be things of the past. What I want you to know is that in knowing this part of Jesus' story, you can also know the end of your own. What happened for him can also happen for you. All you need to do is what I did that morning. All you need to do is believe. Thanks be to God.